In the dense forests of upstate New York, 143 unmarked graves were discovered in 1862 beneath the floorboards of an abandoned church. The local authorities documented that each skeleton showed signs of systematic torture, fractured limbs that had healed before death, evidence of repeated near-drowning and strange markings carved into their bones. For over 160 years, federal records about the Church of the Pure Spirit remained sealed, accessible only to those with special clearance. I've obtained documents never before revealed to the public that detail how three brothers, known as Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft, convinced hundreds of devoted followers that suffering was the only path to salvation, and how their dark rituals of purification led to what may be the most disturbing religious cult in American history. The small settlement of Ravenwood in upstate New York was unremarkable in most ways during the early 19th century. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, approximately 40 miles north of Albany, it consisted of perhaps 300 souls who made their living through farming, timber, and trade with neighboring communities. The town had been founded in 1803 by settlers moving north from the Hudson Valley, seeking fertile land and new opportunities. Like much of upstate New York during this period, Ravenwood found itself at the epicenter of what historians would later call the Second Great Awakening, a period of intense religious revival that swept across America in the early 1800s. The region became known as the Burned-Over District, due to the fervor of religious movements that seemed to ignite and spread like wildfire across its communities. It was a time when new denominations were born, old faiths were questioned, and charismatic preachers could draw crowds numbering in the thousands to outdoor revival meetings. Into this spiritual tumult arrived the Ravencroft brothers in the summer of 1825. Elder Ezra, the eldest at 42, had the commanding presence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His deep-set eyes, nearly black in certain light, seemed to peer into one's very soul when he spoke of divine matters. Deacon Silas, 39, was more scholarly in appearance, with wire-rimmed spectacles and slender fingers perpetually stained with ink from his continuous writing of religious texts. Prophet Caleb, the youngest at 35, possessed an unsettling quality that many found both attractive and disturbing. He spoke in whispers that somehow carried across crowded rooms, and his pale blue eyes would often roll back during what he claimed were divine visions. The brothers arrived with substantial means, purchasing a large tract of land on the outskirts of town, where they immediately began construction of what they called the Church of the Pure Spirit. Unlike the simple white clapboard meeting houses common throughout New England and New York, their church was built of dark stone, quarried from the nearby hills. Its architecture was unusual, a central octagonal sanctuary surrounded by 8 smaller chambers, with a steeple rising to a height that seemed excessive for such a remote location. Most striking was the absence of windows in the main sanctuary, with light provided only by carefully positioned lanterns during services. "We have been called by the Spirit to this place," Elder Ezra announced at their first gathering, which curiosity had made well attended despite initial skepticism from locals. "In an age of false prophets and lukewarm faith, we bring the true message of purification through tribulation. The Spirit has revealed to us that this community shall be the cradle of a new understanding." The brothers had timed their arrival perfectly. The religious landscape of 1825 America was fractured and uncertain. Traditional denominations like the Episcopalians and Presbyterians were losing ground to more emotional and demonstrative faiths. Methodists were gaining converts through circuit riders who brought fiery sermons to the frontier. Baptists were expanding rapidly with their emphasis on individual conversion experiences, and new American-born faiths were emerging. The Mormons would begin their journey just 1 year later, and less than 100 miles away, when Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon in 1830. In this environment of spiritual searching, the Ravencrofts' message found fertile ground. Their doctrine was deceptively simple at first. True salvation could only be achieved through suffering that burned away sin and impurity. They cited biblical passages about refinement through fire and Christ's suffering on the cross. But what distinguished their teaching was the literal interpretation. Physical suffering was not just metaphorical, but necessary for spiritual cleansing. The flesh is the vessel of sin, Deacon Silas would explain during early sermons, his voice measured and reasonable. Therefore, the flesh must be tested, tried, and purified through tribulation. Only when the body has been broken can the spirit truly soar. Their congregation grew steadily through that first year. The brothers were selective about who could join, requiring potential members to undergo a discernment interview with Prophet Caleb, who would determine if they were worthy vessels for purification. Those accepted were predominantly from three groups: the desperately poor seeking community and purpose, the deeply troubled seeking redemption from past sins, and the wealthy seeking spiritual experiences beyond what traditional churches offered. Margaret Wilkins was among the first converts. A widow who had lost her husband and 2 children to scarlet fever the previous winter, she had been contemplating ending her life when she encountered Elder Ezra in town. He looked at me as though he could see my thoughts, she wrote in a journal later discovered by federal investigators. He told me my suffering had meaning, that it was preparing me for a greater purpose. For the first time since burying my family, I felt something other than despair. By 1827, the Church of the Pure Spirit had grown to nearly 100 members. Some lived in simple dwellings constructed around the church, while others maintained homes in Ravenwood but spent most of their time at the church compound. The Ravencrofts encouraged members to donate their property and savings to the church, explaining that worldly attachments prevent spiritual elevation. The most devoted followers were invited to become vessels of the Spirit, a special status that required them to undergo more intensive purification rituals. These early ceremonies were relatively mild compared to what would come later: extended fasting, night-long prayer vigils, and rituals involving ice-cold water that symbolized the drowning of the sinful self. What few outsiders realized was how methodically the Ravencrofts were escalating the intensity of these practices. Like the proverbial frog in slowly heating water, their followers were being conditioned to accept increasingly extreme forms of purification, without recognizing the dangerous path they were traveling. By 1829, when construction began on an extensive network of chambers beneath the church, the Ravencrofts had established complete control over their followers' lives, thoughts, and bodies. The stage was set for darkness to descend upon the Church of the Pure Spirit. As Prophet Caleb reportedly told his brothers in a private meeting documented years later, "The sheep have been gathered. Now begins the true work of the shepherd." The people of Ravenwood would soon discover that the Ravencroft brothers' definition of shepherd had little to do with protection and everything to do with sacrifice. The transformation of the Church of the Pure Spirit from an unusual but seemingly benign religious community to something far more sinister can be traced to a specific date: December 21st, 1829, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. What occurred that night would later be referred to in secret church documents as the First Ascension, and would establish the pattern for the horrors that followed. The day began with an announcement from Elder Ezra that Prophet Caleb had received a profound vision during the night. The entire congregation was summoned to the church for what was described as a revelation of the next level of purification. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped below freezing, nearly 150 followers filled the windowless sanctuary, which was illuminated only by 12 large candles positioned at the points of an enormous pattern carved into the wooden floor. a spiral that wound inward toward a central platform. Thomas Hartford, a blacksmith who had joined the church 6 months earlier following the death of his wife, later escaped and provided testimony about what happened next. According to Hartford, Elder Ezra addressed the congregation with unusual intensity, his voice rising to a fever pitch as he described how their previous purification rituals had been merely preparation for the true cleansing. "Brothers and sisters," Elder Ezra proclaimed, "we have been patient shepherds, guiding you gently toward understanding. But the Spirit grows impatient with our progress. Tonight, Prophet Caleb has been shown the true path to salvation, and it requires greater courage than we have yet demanded." At this point, Prophet Caleb emerged from one of the side chambers. Witnesses described him as appearing transformed, his skin unnaturally pale, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his eyes rolled back to show only whites. He began to speak in what he claimed was the tongue of angels, a series of guttural sounds and high-pitched wails that echoed through the sanctuary. After several minutes of this disturbing display, Prophet Caleb collapsed to the floor. When he rose again, he spoke in his normal voice, but with a cadence and authority that many found mesmerizing. He announced that the Spirit had selected 3 members of the congregation for the honor of first ascension: Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters. He called out, "The Spirit has found you worthy of elevation." The 3 individuals, all relatively recent converts to the church, were led to the central platform by Deacon Silas. What followed was described by Hartford as a ceremony unlike anything I believed possible among civilized people. Each of the 3 was stripped to their undergarments despite the winter cold. They were then bound to wooden frames that had been constructed in the shape of inverted crosses. Elder Ezra explained to the congregation that inverting the sacred E symbol was not blasphemy, but rather represented the necessary reversal of fortune, from pride to humility, from comfort to suffering, from life to death to rebirth. For the next several hours, the Ravencroft brothers subjected the 3 chosen ones to a series of torments they called the 7 trials of purification. First came the trial of air, in which wet cloths were placed over their faces while water was slowly poured over them, creating the sensation of drowning. Then came the trial of earth, where soil from the church grounds was packed around their bodies up to their necks, effectively burying them alive for short periods. The trial of fire involved heated metal implements pressed briefly against their skin, leaving burn marks in specific patterns. The trial of water saw them repeatedly submerged in ice-cold water until they lost consciousness, then revived. Hartford's testimony becomes fragmented when describing the final 3 trials, as he admitted to having vomited and nearly fainted during the proceedings. What is clear from multiple accounts is that throughout these tortures, the 3 victims were encouraged to embrace their suffering as divine blessing. Whenever they screamed in pain, the congregation was instructed to chant, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." Most disturbing was the congregation's response. Hartford reported that while some members wept quietly or looked away, many appeared entranced, watching with expressions of reverence or ecstasy. The Ravencrofts had spent years conditioning their followers to associate pain with spiritual advancement, and now that conditioning bore its terrible fruit. Near dawn, when the 7 trials were complete, the 3 victims hung limp on their frames, barely conscious but still alive. Elder Ezra announced that they had been emptied of sin and were now ready to be filled with the pure Spirit. What happened next would haunt those who witnessed it for the remainder of their lives. Prophet Caleb approached each victim and placed his hands on their heads, whispering into their ears. According to Hartford and one other witness who later spoke to authorities, the 3 victims suddenly convulsed violently, their bodies arching against their restraints with such force that bones could be heard breaking. Their eyes flew open, bulging and bloodshot, and they began speaking in the same strange language Prophet Caleb had demonstrated earlier. By sunrise, all three had died. Elder Ezra proclaimed them successfully ascended and declared that their souls had been so thoroughly purified that they had been accepted directly into heaven, bypassing judgment. Their bodies, he explained, were merely empty vessels now, to be revered as holy relics. The three corpses were not buried immediately. Instead, they were placed in one of the newly constructed chambers beneath the church, laid out on stone slabs where congregation members could view them and pray for similar elevation. According to church records later seized by authorities, these were the first of what would eventually become hundreds of bodies stored in the catacombs beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit. The morning after the first ascension, several congregation members quietly packed their belongings and fled Ravenwood. Thomas Hartford was among them, though he would not speak of what he had witnessed for many years, believing no one would believe such horrors possible in Christian America. Those who remained became even more devoted to the Ravencrofts and their twisted doctrine. The brothers had crossed a threshold into murder, disguised as religious ceremony, and found that their control over their followers was not diminished, but strengthened. Within the Church of the Pure Spirit, death had become sacrament, as Prophet Caleb reportedly told his brothers after the ceremony in a conversation later recounted by a church elder who eventually turned state's evidence. Now we have shown them the true face of God, and they did not turn away. There is nothing they will not accept from us now. He was right. The first ascension marked only the beginning of the atrocities at the Church of the Pure Spirit. What followed would be 3 decades of escalating horror, hidden behind the respectable facade of religious devotion. In the years following the first ascension, the Church of the Pure Spirit underwent a transformation that went largely unnoticed by the outside world. From 1830 to 1845, the Ravencroft brothers refined their methods and expanded their influence, developing both their theological justifications and their practical techniques for what they termed elevations, but what were, in reality, ritualized killings. The brothers were careful to maintain a veneer of respectability. The public face of their church emphasized charity, community, and spiritual renewal, themes that resonated perfectly with the ongoing religious revival sweeping through the burned-over district. Outwardly, they participated in the broader religious community, occasionally hosting gatherings where other preachers were invited to speak and making donations to causes such as temperance societies and orphanages. Behind this facade, however, the true nature of their operations grew increasingly complex and disturbing. The underground chambers, initially constructed as simple cellars, were expanded into an elaborate network of tunnels and rooms that extended far beyond the church's footprint. Local workers hired for the initial construction were replaced by devoted church members who could be trusted with secrets, and eventually the excavation was performed exclusively by vessels of the Spirit, followers who had proven their absolute loyalty. By 1835, the catacombs, as they came to be known among the inner circle, contained at least 7 large chambers and dozens of smaller alcoves. Each served a specific function in the Ravencrofts' twisted theology. The Chamber of Preparation, where candidates for elevation were kept in isolation for days before their ordeal. The Chamber of Trials, where the 7 purification tortures were administered. The Chamber of Ascension, where the final fatal rituals took place. And most disturbing of all, the Chamber of Saints, where the bodies of the ascended were preserved. This preservation of corpses became a central element of the cult's practices. Unlike most religious groups that reverently bury their dead, the Ravencrofts kept the bodies of their victims in various states of preservation. Some were partially mummified using techniques Deacon Silas had allegedly learned from medical texts. Others were reduced to clean skeletons through methods that investigators would later struggle to reconstruct. These remains were arranged in elaborate tableaux throughout the Chamber of Saints, posed in positions of prayer or ecstasy, sometimes articulated with wire to maintain their posture. Elizabeth Carver, who joined the church in 1832 and eventually escaped in 1844, provided some of the most detailed accounts of these chambers. "The smell was the first thing that struck you," she recounted to federal investigators. "Not the stench of decay, as one might expect, but the overwhelming odor of chemicals, turpentine, alcohol, and something sweeter I couldn't identify. The brothers claimed it was the perfume of sanctity, but I later learned it was substances used in embalming." Carver described how new members were gradually introduced to the existence of these chambers, first hearing about them as symbolic spaces, then being permitted limited access to the less disturbing areas, and finally, for those deemed most loyal, being allowed to witness or even participate in the rituals conducted within them. "It was a careful seduction," she explained. "By the time you saw the Chamber of Saints with its dozens of corpses arranged like some grotesque congregation, you had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that it seemed beautiful rather than horrifying. I remember weeping with what I thought was religious ecstasy the first time I was permitted entry. Now those tears shame me beyond words." The frequency of elevations increased gradually over the years. In 1830, according to church records later seized as evidence, there were only 2 such ceremonies, resulting in 5 deaths. By 1835, the number had risen to quarterly events, each claiming 2 to 4 lives. And by 1840, monthly elevations had become the norm, with special ceremonies on solstices and equinoxes often taking larger numbers of victims. The Ravencrofts became selective in choosing candidates for elevation. Initially, they favored those without close family connections, widows, orphans, and drifters who would not be missed. Later, as their confidence grew, they began selecting from devoted families within the congregation, framing selection as the highest honor a family could receive. To give a child to the spirit was considered the ultimate expression of faith, Carver recalled. Parents would compete for this blessing, offering their sons and daughters with a fervor that seems unimaginable to me now. While the brothers maintained their distinct roles, Elder Ezra as the authoritative voice, Deacon Silas as the scholarly theologian, and Prophet Caleb as the mystical conduit to the divine, their private dynamics shifted over time. According to accounts from former Inner Circle members, Caleb's influence grew as his visions directed ever more aspects of church life. By 1840, it was Caleb who selected all candidates for elevation and determined the specific rituals to be used in each case. His mental state appears to have deteriorated significantly during this period. Journal entries attributed to him, recovered from a hidden compartment in his private quarters, reveal increasingly incoherent writings interspersed with detailed anatomical drawings. One entry from 1842 reads, "The Spirit has revealed that souls reside not merely in the heart or mind as commonly thought, but are distributed throughout the body in specific nodes. Each elevation allows me to map these sacred points more precisely. Soon, I shall have the complete divine anatomy." As the church's membership grew to nearly 300 by 1845, the Ravencrofts faced the practical challenge of disposing of evidence from their increasing number of elevations. This led to one of their most macabre innovations, the selling of human remains to medical schools. In the mid-19th century, medical colleges struggled to obtain cadavers for anatomical study. Legal sources were limited primarily to executed criminals, leaving an insufficient supply for teaching purposes. This created a black market for bodies, with resurrection men illegally exhuming the recently buried or claiming unclaimed bodies from poorhouses. Deacon Silas, whose scholarly pursuits had given him connections in academic circles, established relationships with agents who supplied medical schools in Albany, New York City, and as far away as Philadelphia. Church records indicate that between 1840 and 1845, at least 67 vessels were donated to the advancement of medical science, a euphemism for the sale of murder victims' bodies. This commercial aspect served multiple purposes for the Ravencrofts. It disposed of evidence, generated significant income for the church, and provided Deacon Silas with access to medical knowledge that he incorporated into the cult's practices. From these transactions, he learned improved preservation techniques and more efficient methods of causing pain without leaving external marks. Knowledge that would make the church's later atrocities even more sophisticated. By 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit had evolved from a fringe religious group into something unprecedented. A self-sustaining system of indoctrination, ritual murder, and profit disguised as spiritual advancement. The brothers had created what one federal investigator would later call a perfect machine for evil, operating in plain sight under the protection of religious freedom. Yet despite their careful management of appearances, rumors began to spread. The sheer number of people who had joined the church only to disappear from public life raised questions. Former members who had fled rarely spoke openly about their experiences, fearing either disbelief or retaliation. But their haunted expressions and reluctance to discuss their time with the Ravencrofts fueled local suspicions. It was these growing murmurs, combined with an unexpected discovery by a postal inspector investigating financial irregularities, that would eventually draw official attention to the quiet horror unfolding in Ravenwood. But that reckoning still lay years in the future. For now, the Church of the Pure Spirit continued its dark work, its true nature hidden beneath layers of religious respectability and the fervent devotion of followers who had been taught to see murder as the highest form of worship. Before we continue with the story of the Church of the Pure Spirit, if you're enjoying this dark tale of religious horror in America's past, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. Your support helps us bring more of these forgotten historical nightmares to light. Now, let's return to the twisted world of the Ravencroft brothers. The public face of the Church of the Pure Spirit reached its zenith during the late 1840s. To the outside world, the Ravencroft brothers appeared to be successful religious leaders riding the wave of the Second Great Awakening. Their compound had expanded to include not only the main church building and underground chambers, but also dormitories for single members, modest homes for families, workshops where church goods were produced, and even a small school for the children of followers. Visitors to Ravenwood often commented on the prosperity and orderliness of the church community. The Ravencrofts were particularly careful about who they allowed onto their property, generally limiting access to potential converts who had been carefully vetted or to respected community figures they wished to impress. During these sanctioned visits, what outsiders saw was the industrious religious community where members worked together, prayed together, and supported one another. What remained invisible was the web of psychological control, the nighttime rituals in the underground chambers, and the steadily increasing number of elevations. Also hidden was the growing wealth of the Ravencroft brothers, amassed through donations from followers, the sale of human remains to medical schools, and various businesses operated under church auspices, but primarily benefiting the brothers. The first significant thread that would eventually unravel their carefully constructed facade appeared in 1847, when James Thornhill, a postal inspector investigating financial irregularities in several upstate New York communities, noticed unusual patterns in banking transactions connected to the Church of the Pure Spirit. Large sums deposited at irregular intervals, always in cash, Thornhill noted in his official report. Amounts consistent with institutional deposits rather than individual banking. Transfers to medical colleges in Albany, Philadelphia, and Baltimore with vague notations regarding research donations. Thornhill's investigation might have remained focused solely on potential financial improprieties had he not encountered Martha Simmons, a former church member who had fled the community after witnessing her sister's elevation in 1846. Initially reluctant to speak about her experiences, Simmons eventually provided Thornhill with the first official testimony about the true nature of the Ravencrofts' activities. She spoke of rituals involving torture, of bodies kept in underground chambers, of children being selected for special blessings and never seen again. Thornhill wrote, "Claims so outlandish that I would have dismissed them as the ravings of a disturbed mind had they not aligned so perfectly with the financial irregularities I'd already documented." Thornhill brought his concerns to his superiors, but the response was tepid at best. Religious freedom was strongly protected, and accusations against a church required extraordinary evidence. Without permission to pursue an official investigation, Thornhill continued gathering information privately, creating a network of contacts around Ravenwood who could report on the church's activities. One such contact was Dr. William Garrett, a physician in Albany who had grown suspicious about the condition of cadavers he examined that allegedly came from the Church of the Pure Spirit. Standard practice was to receive bodies of the deceased who had donated their remains to medical science, Garrett later testified. But these specimens showed signs of systematic ante-mortem trauma, injuries sustained before death that had partially healed. And the manner of death itself was consistent across multiple bodies, evidence of asphyxiation combined with extreme physical stress. In 1850, Garrett secretly reached out to Thornhill, providing detailed medical reports on 7 bodies he had examined. These documents provided the first scientific evidence that something sinister was occurring at the Church of the Pure Spirit. Still, authorities remained reluctant to act against a religious organization without irrefutable proof of criminal activity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In the spring of 1851, Prophet Caleb Ravencroft's mental state, which had been deteriorating for years, reached a crisis point. According to accounts from church members who later testified, he began experiencing violent episodes where he would rave about spirits emerging from the walls and the divine anatomy becoming visible in the air. During church services, his prophetic utterances became increasingly bizarre and frightening, even to the most devoted followers. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas attempted to manage the situation by limiting Prophet Caleb's public appearances, explaining his absences as periods of intense communion with the Spirit. In private, however, they confined him to a specially constructed room in the furthest reaches of the underground chambers, where his screams would not be heard above ground. This confinement might have contained the immediate problem had Prophet Caleb not escaped during a momentary lapse in supervision. On the night of June 17, 1851, he somehow freed himself from his restraints and made his way through the catacombs to emerge in the woods beyond the church property. What followed was described in the Albany Evening Journal as a scene of public madness unprecedented in the region's history. Naked and covered in self-inflicted wounds, Prophet Caleb appeared in Ravenwood's town square during a community gathering celebrating the summer planting. Before a crowd of horrified onlookers, he proclaimed himself the living vessel of the Pure Spirit, and began describing in explicit detail the rituals conducted beneath the church. "The blood of the purified strengthens our connection to the divine," he reportedly shouted. 217 vessels have been emptied, and the Spirit has filled me with their essence. The chambers beneath hold the sacred remains of the elevated, and soon all of you shall join them in glorious suffering. Local authorities detained Prophet Caleb, initially believing him to be simply a dangerous lunatic. When he identified himself as one of the Ravencroft brothers, however, his ravings took on new significance. Thornhill, who had cultivated relationships with several local officials, was notified immediately. He arrived in Ravenwood the following day to interview Prophet Caleb. What he found was a man in the final stages of complete psychological collapse. Prophet Caleb alternated between periods of catatonic silence and frenzied confession, during which he provided details about the church's activities that corroborated earlier testimonies from escaped members. Most significantly, he drew detailed maps of the underground chambers, including locations of hidden entrances and the Chamber of Saints, where victims' remains were kept. Armed with this new evidence and Prophet Caleb's first-hand testimony, Thornhill finally secured authorization for an official investigation. However, word of Prophet Caleb's detention and subsequent questioning reached Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas before authorities could organize a proper search of the church grounds. What happened next demonstrated the brothers' ruthless efficiency in crisis management. Within hours of learning of Prophet Caleb's detention, they initiated what church records later revealed was a contingency plan called the Cleansing Flame. Members of the inner circle were dispatched to remove the most incriminating evidence from the underground chambers, particularly financial records and the most recently deceased bodies. Then, in a move that showed both desperation and calculated cunning, they orchestrated a controlled fire in the main church building. The fire was carefully set to destroy specific areas while leaving others intact, creating the appearance of a tragic accident rather than deliberate destruction of evidence. By the time authorities arrived with a search warrant on June 19, 1851, they found the church building partially burned and the congregation engaged in recovery efforts. Elder Ezra greeted officials with apparent cooperation, expressing shock at his brother's mental breakdown and offering full access to the property. "It seems God has tested us doubly," he reportedly told investigators. "First with the affliction of my beloved brother's mind, and now with this terrible fire. But we shall rebuild, as faith must always rise from ashes." The investigation that followed was hampered not only by the fire damage, but by the brothers' meticulous preparation. The entrance to the main tunnel system had been collapsed in the fire, making access difficult. When excavation finally revealed the underground chambers, investigators found them partially flooded, a result of deliberately diverted water from a nearby stream. Many rooms had been emptied of their contents, with evidence of hasty removal. Nevertheless, enough remained to confirm the most disturbing aspects of Prophet Caleb's confession. In chambers that had escaped both fire and flooding, investigators discovered specialized restraints, tools modified for torture, and chemical compounds used in embalming. Most damning was the Chamber of Saints, where despite efforts to remove evidence, dozens of human remains were found in various states of preservation. "The scene defies adequate description," wrote federal investigator Daniel Blackwood in his official report. "Skeletal remains arranged in poses of supplication, partially preserved corpses seated as though participating in some macabre congregation, and most disturbing, small chambers containing the remains of children, positioned as though at play but bearing clear evidence of violent deaths." The discovery shocked even hardened investigators. Newspaper accounts, though heavily censored due to Victorian sensibilities, conveyed enough details to create widespread horror. The Albany Evening Journal's headline on June 25, 1851 read simply, "House of Worship Revealed as Charnel House. Brothers accused of unspeakable acts in the name of religion." As authorities worked to identify the remains and determine the full extent of the Ravencrofts' crimes, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas maintained their innocence. They claimed that Prophet Caleb had conducted his activities in secret, without their knowledge or approval, and expressed shock and dismay at the discoveries. Given their careful compartmentalization of church operations, this defense might have carried some weight had it not been for one final, damning piece of evidence. In a hidden compartment beneath Deacon Silas's personal quarters, investigators discovered a leather-bound ledger documenting every elevation from 1829 to 1851. The book, written in Deacon Silas's distinctive handwriting, contained names, dates, descriptions of methods used, and notations regarding the disposition of remains, including those sold to medical institutions. Most incriminating were entries specifically attributing direction and participation to all three brothers, with special mention of Elder Ezra's role in selecting candidates for elevation. This ledger, combined with testimony from former members and Prophet Caleb's confession, provided overwhelming evidence of the brothers' guilt. On July 3, 1851, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft were arrested on multiple charges of murder, fraud, and desecration of human remains. The case against the Ravencroft brothers would become one of the most sensational trials of the mid-19th century. Though much of the most disturbing evidence was kept from public view by authorities concerned about its potential impact on public morality and religious sensibilities, the investigation continued to uncover new horrors, expanding well beyond the events at the church itself, to include the brothers' earlier activities and the full network of their operations. But even as the legal process moved forward, the darkest secrets of the Church of the Pure Spirit remained hidden, awaiting discovery by those who would continue to investigate long after the Ravencrofts had faced justice. As the investigation into the Church of the Pure Spirit deepened through the summer of 1851, authorities found themselves confronting a criminal enterprise far more extensive than initially believed. The Ravencroft brothers had created not merely a cult with aberrant practices, but an intricate system that extended tendrils into multiple aspects of American society: religious, medical, and financial. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas remained in custody awaiting trial, while Prophet Caleb had been committed to the state lunatic asylum at Utica, deemed too mentally unstable to stand trial. Their followers, meanwhile, had scattered, some fleeing to avoid prosecution, others remaining in Ravenwood in a state of shock and disbelief, their entire worldview shattered by the revelations. Federal investigator Daniel Blackwood, assigned to lead the case, established a temporary office in Ravenwood to coordinate the sprawling investigation. As he pieced together evidence from church records, witness testimonies, and forensic examinations, a disturbing timeline emerged that stretched back even before the brothers' arrival in upstate New York. The Ravencrofts did not begin their crimes in Ravenwood, Blackwood wrote in a confidential report to his superiors in Washington. Evidence suggests similar activities in at least 3 previous locations, dating back to 1817. In each case, they established a religious community, gathered vulnerable followers, and departed before authorities became suspicious. What distinguishes Ravenwood is not the nature of their activities, but their duration and scale. Records recovered from a hidden vault beneath Deacon Silas's quarters revealed that the brothers had operated under different names in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Ohio before settling in New York. In each location, they had refined their methods, learning from mistakes and developing the theological framework that would eventually become the doctrine of the Church of the Pure Spirit. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting the brothers had not acted entirely alone. Correspondence between Deacon Silas and individuals at several medical colleges indicated knowledge, if not explicit awareness, of the illicit source of the specimens being provided. One letter from a prominent Philadelphia anatomist, dated D. 1844, praised the exceptional quality and unique preparation of bodies received from the church, noting that the subjects show evidence of systematic anatomical study prior to death, as though the bodies were prepared for our work while still living. This revelation opened a new and horrifying dimension to the case. The Ravencrofts had not merely been killing their followers in the name of religious purification. They had been conducting systematic experiments on living subjects, documenting their findings, and selling both the bodies and their research to medical institutions. The brothers appear to have been conducting a form of primitive physiological research. Dr. Samuel Prescott of the Albany Medical College stated in his expert testimony to investigators, the patterns of injury, the methods of preserving tissue, and the detailed anatomical notes suggest an attempt to study human responses to various stimuli, particularly pain and its effects on the body's systems. In August 1851, the investigation took an unexpected turn when a respected physician from Boston came forward with information that transformed understanding of the case. Dr. Jonathan Crane had been a student at Harvard Medical School in the 1820s, where he had briefly encountered a visiting lecturer named Simon Ravingwood, who presented controversial theories about pain responses and religious ecstasy. I remember being disturbed by his methods and conclusions, Dr. Crane testified. He described experiments that seemed unethical even by the standards of that time, and spoke of pain as a gateway to transcendent experience. I had dismissed him as a medical eccentric, but seeing the newspaper accounts of the Ravencroft case, I recognized not only the theories, but the man himself from the published sketches. Simon Ravingwood and Silas Ravencroft are undoubtedly the same person. This connection suggested that the religious doctrine of the Church of the Pure Spirit had not been merely a means of controlling followers or justifying murder, but rather that the religious framework had been constructed specifically to facilitate systematic human experimentation. The brothers had created a belief system that not only permitted but sanctified the very acts that served their research. As investigators followed this new line of inquiry, they discovered a hidden room beneath Deacon Silas's quarters that contained hundreds of notebooks filled with detailed anatomical drawings, experimental protocols, and observations. The journals documented a grotesque research program spanning decades, with entries becoming increasingly scientific and less religious in their language as time progressed. Subject 157 maintained consciousness for 47 minutes after removal of redacted. Read one particularly disturbing entry from 1848. Heart continued functioning for 12 minutes beyond loss of consciousness. Vocalization patterns consistent with previous trials. Blood loss measured at approximately 1.7 liters. Results support hypotheses regarding sustainability of vital functions under extreme conditions. When this evidence was presented to Elder Ezra during interrogation, his facade of religious devotion finally cracked. According to transcripts of the interview, he laughed for nearly a minute before speaking. "You understand nothing," he reportedly told Blackwood. "The spirit has many names. Some call it God, others science. We merely sought knowledge that others were too weak to pursue. The elevation of our followers was genuine. They contributed to understanding that will benefit mankind for generations. Their suffering had purpose. Their deaths had meaning." The discovery of the brothers' true motives sent shockwaves through the medical establishment. Several prominent physicians and medical schools that had received specimens or research from the Ravencrofts found themselves under scrutiny, forcing a broader conversation about ethical standards in medical research and education. Meanwhile, as autumn approached, investigators continued the grim work of excavating the church grounds. Initial estimates of victims had been based on Prophet Caleb's claim of 217 vessels. But as the dig progressed, it became clear that the actual number was significantly higher. "We have identified remains of at least 276 individuals thus far," Blackwood reported in September. "Based on soil analysis and structural expansion of the underground chambers, we believe additional remains may be found beneath the adjacent property." The brothers appear to have been tunneling outward as their operation expanded. The investigation was further complicated by the discovery of correspondence suggesting that not all of the victims had been willing members of the church. Letters between Elder Ezra and various associates in nearby towns indicated a system for identifying and acquiring suitable subjects. predominantly travelers, immigrants, and others who would not be immediately missed. The red-haired Irishman who passed through last Thursday would make an excellent vessel. Read one such letter from a church member in a neighboring community. No family, seeking work, strong constitution. I have directed him to Ravenwood with promise of employment at the mill. Expect his arrival by Saturday next. This evidence transformed understanding of the case from one of religious extremism, preying on willing followers, to something closer to organized abduction and murder for both profit and pseudoscientific research. The implications were disturbing not only for the scale of the brothers' crimes, but for the suggestion of a wider network of complicity. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Ravenwood intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The breakthrough that would ultimately reveal the full extent of the Ravencroft's operation came in October 1851, when investigators located Samuel Parsons, who had served as the church's accountant from 1835 to 1849 before being replaced by a newer member. Living under an assumed name in western Massachusetts, Parsons had fled the church after discovering the true purpose of certain financial transactions. I believed I was managing donations and legitimate business interests, Parsons testified, after being granted immunity. When I discovered entries for specimen preparation and research grants that corresponded with disappearances among the congregation, I began keeping private records. When Elder Ezra discovered my separate ledger, I was scheduled for special prayer counseling, a term I had learned meant selection for elevation. I fled that night with only the clothes on my back. Parsons provided investigators with detailed financial information from memory, including names of medical institutions that had paid for bodies and research, wealthy patrons who had funded the brothers' work believing it to be legitimate scientific inquiry, and church members who had assisted in various aspects of the operation. Most significantly, he revealed the existence of a second facility located nearly 40 miles from Ravenwood, a remote farmhouse that the brothers had purchased through an intermediary in 1840. According to Parsons, this location was used for special research that was kept separate even from the inner circle of the church. Elder Ezra called it the Garden, Parsons recalled. Only he, Deacon Silas, and 2 trusted assistants ever went there. Supplies were delivered monthly: medical equipment, chemicals, specialized restraints, and occasionally selected subjects would be transported there, always at night. None ever returned. When authorities located and searched the farmhouse, what they discovered exceeded even the horrors found beneath the church. The building had been converted into a sophisticated research facility with rooms designed for different types of experiments. Detailed records indicated that this location had been used primarily for long-term studies. Subjects kept alive for weeks or months while various procedures were performed and documented. Most disturbing was evidence that the brothers had been particularly interested in the effects of their purification techniques on children. A separate building on the property contained small cells and equipment sized for juvenile subjects. Records indicated that at least 37 children, ranging in age from 4 to 16, had been held at the facility between 1840 and 1851. This discovery galvanized public outrage like nothing before. Newspapers that had been relatively restrained in their coverage now published lurid details, with the New York Tribune running the headline, "Monsters in Human Form, Ravencroft Brothers' Crimes Against Innocents Revealed." Public demonstrations demanded swift justice, and political pressure mounted for an exemplary prosecution. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas, who had maintained a certain composure throughout earlier phases of the investigation, reportedly showed signs of breaking under the accumulated evidence. Prison guards noted that Elder Ezra had begun speaking to invisible presences in his cell, while Deacon Silas attempted suicide after being confronted with evidence from the garden. As 1851 drew to a close, the case against the Ravencroft brothers had grown from a local horror to a national sensation. The upcoming trial promised to be one of the most significant criminal proceedings in American history, with implications not only for the defendants, but for religious freedom, medical ethics, and the dark capabilities that could hide behind respectable facades. Yet even as preparations for the trial progressed, investigator Blackwood remained troubled by lingering questions. The brothers' activities spanned too many years and locations to have gone completely undetected. Their connections to medical institutions and wealthy patrons suggested a level of protection that seemed implausible without some form of official complicity. And the sophistication of their operation indicated resources beyond what church donations alone could provide. I am increasingly convinced that we have uncovered merely the visible portion of something far more extensive. Blackwood wrote in his personal journal in December 1851, "The Ravencrofts are undoubtedly guilty of unconscionable crimes, but I cannot escape the suspicion that they were part of a larger enterprise, one that may continue to operate despite their apprehension. The question that haunts me is not whether justice will be served in this case, but whether the full truth will ever come to light." His concerns would prove prophetic in ways he could not have anticipated as the trial of the century prepared to begin in Albany in January 1852. The trial of Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft began on January 12, 1852 in Albany, New York, amid unprecedented security and public interest. The courthouse was surrounded daily by crowds numbering in the thousands, some traveling from as far as Boston and Philadelphia to witness proceedings in what newspapers had dubbed the trial of the unholy brothers. Inside the courtroom, the BU prosecution presented a methodical case that unfolded over 6 weeks, with over 100 witnesses providing testimony about various aspects of the Ravencrofts' crimes. Survivors of the church described the psychological manipulation and gradual indoctrination that had led them to accept increasingly extreme purification rituals. Medical experts detailed their examinations of recovered remains, confirming patterns of systematic torture and experimentation. Financial records demonstrated the brothers' profit from selling bodies and research. The most powerful testimony came from families of victims who described their loved ones' gradual transformation under the brothers' influence, ending with their disappearance or reported death under suspicious circumstances. Sarah Wilkinson, whose daughter Emma had joined the church in 1847 at age 16 and ascended 6 months later, spoke of receiving letters in her daughter's handwriting that grew increasingly strange before stopping entirely. The final letter said she had been selected for special blessing and that I should rejoice in her coming elevation, Wilkinson testified. When I traveled to Ravenwood to see her, Elder Ezra told me she had been transported to their retreat for spiritual preparation and would not receive visitors. 3 weeks later, he informed me she had ascended to the pure spirit during a sacred ceremony. I was not permitted to see her body, which he claimed had been sanctified and could not leave church grounds. Throughout the proceedings, the EAOC defendants' behaviors diverged dramatically. Deacon Silas appeared withdrawn, rarely making eye contact and speaking only to his attorneys in whispers. Elder Ezra, however, maintained an unsettling composure, often smiling during the most damning testimony and occasionally nodding as though in approval of the descriptions of his crimes. When the defense finally presented its case in late February, their strategy became clear. They would not deny the deaths or even many of the practices described, but would instead argue that the activities of the Church of the Pure Spirit were protected religious expression and that members had participated voluntarily. The Constitution of these United States guarantees freedom of religious practice, defense attorney William Hargrove argued. The ceremonies of the Church of the Pure Spirit while perhaps shocking to conventional sensibilities, were conducted with the full knowledge and consent of participants who shared the Ravencrofts' belief in purification through suffering. This defense collapsed under cross-examination of former church members who testified to coercion, deception, and the administration of substances now identified as containing opium and other mind-altering compounds. The final blow came when the prosecution presented the records from the garden, showing clearly that many victims had been outright abducted rather than recruited as church members. On March 2, 1852, with the trial moving toward its inevitable conclusion, Elder Ezra made a request that would transform the proceedings. He asked to testify in his own defense against the strong advice of his attorneys. The judge, after considerable deliberation, allowed it. What followed was perhaps the most chilling courtroom testimony in American judicial history. For nearly 4 hours, Elder Ezra spoke without notes, delivering what amounted to a sermon on his beliefs and practices. He neither denied the charges nor expressed remorse, but instead offered a coherent, if terrifying, philosophy that combined religious mysticism with scientific rationalism in service of what he called the elevation of humanity through systematic understanding of transcendence. "Death comes to all," he told the stunned courtroom. "We merely gave it purpose. Those who ascended through our ministrations contributed to knowledge that will ultimately benefit all mankind. Their suffering was temporary, their contribution eternal." Most disturbing was his clear intellectual capacity and the systematic way he had constructed a belief system to justify atrocity. He spoke of pain as the purest form of consciousness, of death as merely a transition of energy, and of his victims as willing participants in the greatest scientific and spiritual endeavor of our age. When prosecutor James Sullivan asked about the children found at the garden, Elder Ezra's response sent audible gasps through the courtroom. "The young vessel receives the Spirit most purely. Their observations were most valuable precisely because they were unclouded by preconception. We honored them by allowing their suffering to illuminate paths others fear to tread." At this statement, a man in the gallery, later identified as Harold Winters, whose son had disappeared after attending a church service in 1847, rushed toward the witness stand with a concealed knife. He was restrained by court officers before reaching Elder Ezra, who had not flinched or attempted to move. "You see," Elder Ezra remarked calmly after Winters had been removed. "Even now, the mere suggestion of truth provokes violence from those too limited to comprehend it. This has always been the response to those who push beyond conventional boundaries of knowledge and belief." After Elder Ezra's testimony, Deacon Silas declined to take the stand. His attorney offered only a brief statement, suggesting that his client had been under his brother's influence and requesting mercy on those grounds. The prosecution's closing arguments emphasized the calculated nature of the brothers' crimes, the suffering of their victims, and the betrayal of both religious faith and scientific principle their actions represented. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. On March 10, 1852, Judge William Blackwood sentenced the Ravencroft brothers to death by hanging, declaring their crimes an offense against God, humanity, and the moral foundation upon which civilized society rests. The execution was scheduled for April 15th, but events would take an unexpected turn in the intervening weeks. Prophet Caleb, who had been confined to the asylum at Utica, died under mysterious circumstances on March 20th. Official reports stated he had succumbed to nervous exhaustion, but rumors suggested either suicide or murder by attendants who had learned of his connection to the notorious case. More significantly, on the night of April 7th, a fire broke out in the Albany jail where the Ravencroft brothers were being held. By the time the blaze was controlled, 3 inmates and 2 guards had died from smoke inhalation. Initial reports indicated that Deacon Silas was among the dead, his body identified by distinctive rings he wore. Elder Ezra, however, was not found among either the dead or the survivors. The manhunt that followed was the largest in New York, state history to that point. Federal authorities joined local law enforcement in searching for the escaped prisoner, with wanted posters distributed throughout the Northeast. Reported sightings came from as far away as Chicago and Montreal, but none led to capture. As weeks passed without success, troubling questions emerged about the circumstances of the jail fire and Deacon Silas's death. The official identification had been made hastily, based primarily on personal effects, rather than clear recognition of the badly burned body. Some investigators, including Blackwood, questioned whether either brother had actually died in the fire. The timing and nature of the incident suggests planning and outside assistance, Blackwood wrote in a confidential report. The possibility must be considered that both brothers escaped, with one corpse misidentified as Deacon Silas, while another prisoner remains unaccounted for in the confusion. This theory gained credibility when investigators discovered that a substantial sum, nearly $30,000, had been withdrawn from a bank account connected to the church just 2 days before the fire by an individual matching the description of Jacob Thornton, one of the brothers' most devoted followers who had disappeared after their arrest. The most disturbing development came in June 1852, when a physician in Baltimore was found murdered in his home under bizarre circumstances. Dr. Edward Mitchell had been one of the medical professionals implicated in receiving specimens from the Church of the Pure Spirit, though he had cooperated with authorities and avoided prosecution. His body was discovered positioned in a manner identical to the elevated victims from the church, with a note pinned to his chest reading simply, "The Spirit sees all who betray its work." This killing, followed by similar murders of 2 other physicians with connections to the case over the next year, suggested that the brothers, or their followers, were systematically eliminating those who had assisted the investigation. Each victim was found arranged in the same ritual posture, each with a similar note, creating a wave of fear among those who had been involved in the case. By 1854, the active investigation had been scaled back, with Elder Ezra presumed to have fled the country. Occasional reports of religious groups with practices reminiscent of the Church of the Pure Spirit emerged from places as distant as New Orleans, St. Louis, and San Francisco, but none led to the recapture of the infamous preacher. Blackwood, who had been reassigned to other cases but continued to investigate the Ravencrofts privately, became convinced that Elder Ezra had not merely escaped, but had reconstituted his operation in some new location, perhaps with the assistance of a network of followers more extensive than initially believed. The Ravencroft case represents not the end of a criminal enterprise, but merely its exposure, he wrote in his final report before retiring in 1860. The combination of religious fervor, scientific curiosity without moral constraint, and the promise of transcendent knowledge creates a powerful allure that did not die with our prosecution of 2 of its practitioners. I fear we have merely driven this darkness further into the shadows, where it continues its work beyond our sight. His assessment would prove prophetic. In the decades that followed, scattered reports would emerge of religious groups with striking similarities to the Church of the Pure Spirit, appearing briefly before disappearing again, often leaving unexplained disappearances in their wake. None were directly linked to Elder Ezra Ravencroft, yet the pattern suggested his influence lived on. The most significant such incident occurred in 1862, a decade after the original case, when a small church calling itself the Sanctuary of Divine Understanding was discovered abandoned near the Massachusetts-Vermont border. Local authorities, investigating reports of strange noises and lights, found an empty building with a hidden cellar containing evidence of recent ritual activities consistent with the Ravencrofts' practices. Most disturbing was a journal recovered from the site, written in handwriting experts would later confirm matched Elder Ezra's known script. The final entry, dated just 3 days before the discovery, read, "The work continues as it must. Each vessel contributes to understanding. Each elevation brings the final revelation closer. 100 years from now, when the full truth emerges, all will recognize our sacrifice as the foundation of a new age of understanding. The Spirit is patient. So too must be its servants. Whether this represented Elder Ezra's final testament or merely another disappearance before resurfacing elsewhere remains unknown. No confirmed sighting of him was ever recorded after the Albany jail fire, leaving his ultimate fate as one of the great unsolved mysteries of American criminal history. The official investigation into the Church of the Pure Spirit and the Ravencroft brothers formally concluded in 1862 with the discovery of the abandoned Sanctuary of Divine Understanding and the journal attributed to Elder Ezra. Federal authorities, stretched thin by the demands of the Civil War, classified the case as resolved despite the lack of certainty regarding Elder Ezra's fate. The physical evidence from both Ravenwood and the subsequent sites linked to the brothers was consolidated in a special archive within the Department of Justice, accessible only to officials with specific authorization. This collection, including journals, ritual implements, financial records, and anatomical drawings, remained largely unexamined for decades, a testament to the government's discomfort with the brothers' legacy. In the communities affected by the Ravencrofts, the process of healing and reconciliation proceeded slowly. Ravenwood itself never fully recovered from its association with the notorious case. The church property was seized by the state, the buildings demolished, and the land left vacant. Many residents relocated rather than live with the stigma of connection to what newspapers had called the American House of Horror. Those who had lost family members to the brothers' elevations formed a support society that eventually expanded to include survivors of similar experiences elsewhere. This group, initially called the Assembly of Reconciliation and later known simply as the Assembly, dedicated itself to identifying and exposing religious practices that crossed the line into exploitation or abuse. The most profound and lasting impact of the Ravencroft case, however, emerged in the field of medical ethics. The revelation that respected medical institutions had knowingly or unknowingly benefited from the brothers' crimes prompted the first serious national conversation about the sourcing of cadavers for medical education and the ethical boundaries of research. In 1855, the American Medical Association adopted its first formal code of ethics regarding anatomical specimens, requiring documentation of legal acquisition for all bodies used in teaching or research. This was followed in 1858 by legislation in several states establishing stricter regulation of medical schools and anatomical research facilities. Dr. William Harrison, who had been instrumental in bringing the Ravencrofts' connections to medical institutions to light, became a leading advocate for ethical reform. His 1860 treatise on the moral imperative in scientific inquiry directly addressed the Ravencroft case, arguing that knowledge obtained through cruelty is itself corrupted at its source, and that science divorced from humanity's moral compass inevitably leads to atrocity disguised as progress. The brothers' fusion of religious doctrine and pseudoscientific research had exposed vulnerabilities at the intersection of faith, science, and authority. Vulnerabilities that American society would continue to grapple with long after the specific details of their crimes had faded from public memory. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, rumors persisted about Elder Ezra's survival and continued activities. Reported sightings placed him in locations ranging from California gold mining camps to New Orleans spiritual societies to European medical conferences. While none were confirmed, the persistence of these accounts reflected the deep impression his particular brand of charismatic malevolence had left on the American consciousness. More concrete was the evidence of the brothers' continuing influence through followers who had escaped prosecution. Between 1865 and 1890, Authorities identified at least 7 small religious groups in different parts of the country that incorporated elements of the Church of the Pure Spirit's doctrines and practices. While none reached the scale or extremity of the original, their existence suggested that the brothers' ideas had taken root beyond their direct control. The most significant such group was discovered in 1879 in rural Missouri, where a charismatic preacher calling himself Brother Elijah had established a small community centered on the concept of transcendence through tribulation. When local authorities investigated reports of concerning activities, they found ritual, implements and journals directly referencing the Ravencroft's teachings. Brother Elijah, later identified as Thomas Whitfield, a former Inner Circle member of the Church of the Pure Spirit, took his own life rather than face arrest. The final confirmed chapter of the Ravencroft saga came in 1899 when a collection of papers was anonymously donated to the Harvard Medical School library. The materials, contained in a locked iron box, included extensive journals, anatomical drawings, and experimental notes spanning from 1852 to 1898. The year preceding the donation. Handwriting analysis confirmed that the most recent entries were in Elder Ezra's hand, though showing signs of advanced age. The final entry, dated December 31st, 1898, read, "As the century draws to its close, so too does my work in this vessel. Age has finally accomplished what the law could not. I go now to join the pure spirit. Content in knowing that the seeds we planted have taken root and will flower in ways we could only imagine. The next generation of seekers will build upon our foundation, finding new methods for the great work of transcendence. The suffering was necessary. The knowledge remains. The spirit continues." Whether this represented Elder Ezra's genuine final testament or an elaborate hoax has never been definitively established. If authentic, it would indicate that he had survived to the age of 115, an unlikely though not impossible longevity. More significant than the question of authorship, however, was the fact that the journals contained detailed experimental protocols and observations that appeared to have influenced certain legitimate medical research in the early 20th century, suggesting that elements of the brothers' work had indeed infiltrated mainstream science despite their horrific methods. Harvard officials, upon recognizing the nature of the materials, immediately sealed them from public access. In 1902, after consultation with federal authorities, the collection was transferred to a secured government archive where it remained classified until 1972, when limited access was granted to scholars researching the history of medical ethics. The site of the original Church of the Pure Spirit in Ravenwood remained vacant until 1923, when the state of New York designated it a restricted area, fencing the property and posting warnings against trespassing. Local legends claimed the ground was cursed, with stories of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and feelings of overwhelming dread reported by those who ventured too close to the perimeter. In 1967, a team from the State University of New York conducted the first archaeological survey of the site, using then-modern techniques to examine areas that had been inaccessible during the original investigation. Their discoveries included additional human remains in previously unexcavated portions of the tunnel system, bringing the estimated victim count to over 400, significantly higher than the 276 documented in the official record. Most disturbing was the discovery of a sealed chamber containing remarkably well-preserved documents that appeared to outline plans for expansion beyond Ravenwood. These materials suggested that the Church of the Pure Spirit had been intended as merely the first node in a network of similar operations throughout the United States and potentially abroad, a vision that Elder Ezra may have continued pursuing after his escape. Today, more than 160 years after the Ravencrofts' reign of terror was exposed, their legacy persists in multiple domains. In religious studies, they represent an extreme example of how charismatic leadership, incremental normalization of deviant behavior, and the human desire for transcendent meaning can combine to enable atrocity. In medical ethics, their case continues to be cited as a foundational example of the necessity for moral boundaries in scientific inquiry. In criminal psychology, they stand as early examples of organized, systematic killers who operated under the protection of respected social institutions. For the communities and families touched by their crimes, however, the Ravencrofts represent something more immediate and personal, a wound in the fabric of American history that has never fully healed. Descendants of victims and survivors still gather annually in a small ceremony at a memorial established in Albany in 1902, bearing the simple inscription, "For those lost to darkness, that their suffering not be forgotten." The questions that haunted investigator Blackwood in 1852 continue to resonate. How did the brothers develop their unique fusion of religious control and pseudo-scientific experimentation? Who else knew of or facilitated their activities? And, perhaps most disturbingly, how much of their influence persists, unrecognized, in institutions and ideas that continue to shape American society? The true horror of the Ravencroft case lies not merely in the brothers' grotesque acts, but in the recognition that their story represents not an aberration, but a dark possibility inherent in the human capacity for both reverence and cruelty. Their legacy stands as a warning about the dangers when charisma, authority, and ideology combine to override our most fundamental moral constraints. In the dense forests of upstate New York, the land where the Church of the Pure Spirit once stood remains empty, the earth still scarred by foundations that no amount of time seems able to completely erase. Local residents say that even now, on particularly still nights, the area is marked by an unnatural silence, as though something in that soil continues to absorb sound, light, and warmth, hungry for the human suffering that once fed it so abundantly. This mystery shows us how thin the veneer of civilization can be when authority figures twist faith and science to serve their darkest impulses. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.